So I just want to open it up to the floor right now to see if anyone has any follow-up questions to what we've already talked about, or wanted to ask anything of Dr. Mojola. Otherwise, I will be fine. Yeah, and then in the back.
So like when you were transcribing the different languages, were you trying to really focus on more of the literal meaning, or were you trying very hard to paraphrase? Like because it sometimes I see like if I'm trying to translate, I cannot go to the literal meaning because then it won't make sense. So like, did you have to paraphrase for different audiences, or did you keep it the same?
Now, that's a really great question. And it was especially important when someone else was transcribing. So I found myself going back to the tape to sort of see how, because this is the thing about translation, right? Is it's you're interpreting,
Right.
you know, so you're doing meaning making yourself. And sometimes the angle you're taking or the perspective that you have can shape how you choose to translate something. So me and my research assistant would sometimes go back and forth trying to figure out what someone really meant. So for example, in one setting, so you know, we're trying to figure out, you know, so girls in the set, so she was also a young dual woman. So similar to the people that I was studying, she was just out of high school. Really bright, you know, young woman. And so we went to one setting and the girls were sort of saying, you know, we're talking about how boys approach girls for relationships. And so the girls had said something in the interview. And my research assistant disagreed, and she didn't think that they were telling the truth. And the reason turned on sort of how they described the approach. And so she said that no, young men in this setting would say that, I think it's, if I recall my law correctly, like adwar, like I want you, right? And so we're trying to figure out, what does I want you mean? You know, is it I want you in a sexual sense? Is it I want you in a relationship sense? Like, what does that really mean? Right? And so there are sort of alternative ways of figuring out what that means. And so I would often, you know, do both. Like sort of both the sort of literal translation and then potential paraphrases based on the context in which in which the statements were made. So sort of trying to read the quote in the context of the interview as a whole, and also the audience that people were speaking in. But it was complicated, especially because I had to learn the language, so I wasn't also a native speaker. And so I would often ask if I wasn't sure. So for example, the word to marry is called is tedo, which is like to cook. And so the gender differences, again, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm looking at Professor who knows the language better than me. But tedo is to cook. And so someone would say a woman goes to cook for a man, means that a woman is married, you know, to a man. You know, so a man doesn't go to cook for a woman, right? And so the way that word is used, you know, and so the argument I was making in one of my papers was young men were having relationships with women, but the women were the ones who were like the ones who were considered to have married the men. So I had to really, you know, ask a lot of people about the meaning of that particular word. Right? So depending on the argument that I was making in a particular part of either the book or papers, I would have to do more investigation to figure out. But it's a complicated one. That's a complicated question.
Do you have a question?
Oh, usually every time I try to do qualitative stuff, it drains you emotionally.
Yeah.
And so I was just kind of, you know, doing so much of this. How did you cope with, and knowing that sometimes they're talking about things that are horrible, you know, that's why you go, oh my God,
Yeah.
how do you go back and sleep?
Yeah.
And
So I'm just gonna paraphrase into the microphone just in case it didn't get picked up. And so the question is asking you basically, knowing that qualitative work can be particularly draining, and especially given certain topics, that it can be very emotionally draining. How do you cope with that?
Oh, that's a great question. In fact, for me, the trying to learn how to emotionally cope started with the statistics, and I think, and sort of the other piece to your earlier question that I didn't mention was, I didn't believe the numbers when I saw 30% infected, and at the time they weren't rolling out antiretroviral therapy. I couldn't get my head around it. So in fact, I talk about the density of death in the book, because I was like, there must be a lot of death. You know, these are the numbers, there must be a lot of death. And so even coping with the numbers was difficult. But then I went to the field, and it was initially really much worse when I realized, you know, the reality of the taken for granted sense of people dying of AIDS. And I think after a while, I almost, for a while I got used to it, I was numb to it, until a certain point, and so as I was talking earlier today, I couldn't interview anymore. Around, I think after about 7 months, I couldn't do it anymore. And in fact, I haven't been able to return back in a research capacity, because it just became too difficult emotionally. You know, I did, especially the interviews with the HIV positive teenage girls were just heartbreaking. They were heartbreaking. You know, especially girls, you know, a lot of young women get HIV through everyday relationships, right? I think that the stereotype is it's the really promiscuous girls who've got lots of partners, but in fact, just one partner, long term, is risky. You know, especially in settings where the prevalence rate is high. So just to give you an example, if you live in a setting where 1 in 5 people are positive, right? And then imagine you go to a party, 1 in 5 people are positive, right? When you meet someone, you're not thinking, let's do an HIV test. You're thinking, oh, they look nice, let's go out, right? And even in the States context, right? You hook up the next morning, oh, maybe they had an STI. No, whatever you have, I have, right? And so the whole sort of script of going for testing is not part of the how people get together script, you know, and even more in this setting. And so if you can imagine, you know, everyday relationships where, you know, most people don't have HIV. So even with a context where 20% are positive, 80% are not positive, right? So most people don't have HIV. But there are enough people who do that a simple choice of a boyfriend is risky. And just to make it even more clear, the likelihood of getting HIV is about 1 in 1,000 per time that someone has sex. So the one-night stand is actually very low risk. So it's not the one-night stands, but the long-term relationship where there's repeated exposure to HIV. So it's the girl who has a boyfriend for 6 months or a year who's most at risk, not the girl who has the one-night stand, right? And so that's what I mean by the everyday relationship, right? So in the case of this one girl, I'll just never forget. She was 16, and she got HIV from her boyfriend, right? And it was just, you know, and they're just, at the time I interviewed her, they had just started rolling out antiretroviral therapy. So in her case, and she had access to it. So in her case, you know, at least I knew she's not going to die because she doesn't have access to medicine. But I did know that she's going to be on this for the rest of her life, this side of a cure. And what kind of life, you know, because even living with HIV is difficult, even with medication. You know, it's really difficult. And so it was really heartbreaking. But I find that I'm able to work on HIV/AIDS because like I'm not there all the time. Every now and then I have my breakdowns. I have my, I can't do this anymore moments. But most of the time I find it interesting. And that's what helps, that I'm able to not always be emotionally involved. So there are topics that I can't work on, like intimate partner violence, that I have, my colleagues can work on. But for me, I just can't. But HIV/AIDS, I can work on and not always be completely upset. But, as I said, I haven't followed up, for example. I can't, I don't think I can. I don't really want to know what happened. Because it got to be too much. Yeah, there was just, I'll just, finish with this. But I remember especially when I first arrived, started noticing, one town I visited, Bondo, the, class, you sort of see an advertisement for classic coffins. There are more coffins than sofas in the carpentry shop. And then you move further down, you see another branch of, classic coffins. You're like, okay. And then you hear stories of a grandmother who has lost all her children and is taking care of 11 orphans. You go to another community, you hear the same story. You visit someone else and they've taken in, maybe it got too much, It got too much. And so I think it was a reason why I couldn't do any more interviews after a while. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh yeah, because I know it can get so deep that you give up before you get to where you really want to be.
Yeah.
So I mean, with that time maybe you reach the saturation point in terms of data collection.
Yes.
But you could have given up before that just because I started a study that I gave up because I couldn't deal with the crying.
Yeah.
And now you're dealing with the dying.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, no, I was fortunate that I've reached data saturation on most of the questions I was interested in. So I was able to stop.